The sun was just beginning to set when the call came in. A hiker had stumbled upon something strange near the forest's edge. A bobcat, injured and unmoving, its breathing shallow, eyes flickering. The man had expected fear, aggression, or at least a growl. But what he saw instead froze him in place. Curled up beside the wild animal, almost protectively, was a house cat. Small, scrappy, and visibly dirty, it refused to leave the bobcat's side. It hissed when the man approached, shielding the much larger cat as if it were the one in danger. Animal control arrived shortly after. The bobcat was tranquilized for safety, but even as it drifted into unconsciousness, the house cat remained beside it, gently nudging its face with its nose. The officers hesitated. This wasn't just a random encounter. Something was off. Something was different. A strange kind of loyalty hung in the air. No one knew who the house cat belonged to, or how it had ended up in the wild, but it had clearly chosen to stay by this bobcat side. And that moment, so simple, yet so deeply unsettling, was only the beginning of a story that would shock everyone who heard it. At the county rescue center, the two animals were brought in together. The bobcat was rushed into surgery. Its front leg had been caught in an old rusted trap. An infection had set in. It was touch and go. Meanwhile, the house cat paced restlessly, refusing food, meowing constantly. It wouldn't settle when relax. Until, hours later, the vet placed a recovering bobcat in a separate room, and the little house cat jumped onto the exam table, curled into a tight ball next to the larger feline, and purred. Staff were stunned. It was unheard of. Bobcats were wild and solitary. They didn't make friends, especially not with domestic pets. Yet here they were, one recovering, the other guarding, one wild, the other tame. Their worlds weren't supposed to mix, and yet somehow they already had. In the days that followed, security footage captured unbelievable moments. The bobcat, still sedated, would shift restlessly in its sleep, until the house cat gently rested a paw across its chest. Whenever nurses entered, the house cat would stand between them and the bobcat, watching silently, almost possessively. Word began to spread, first among the rescue staff, then volunteers, and then, through a shared Facebook post, the entire town. People couldn't believe it. How could two animals so different find comfort in one another? How could a fragile house cat act like a guardian over a wild predator? Reporters started calling, but the center stayed quiet. They weren't interested in headlines. They were more interested in understanding what they were witnessing, because deep down, even the most experienced wildlife experts, they were beginning to realize this wasn't a coincidence. This was something rare, and maybe something the world hadn't seen before. But beneath all the curiosity and wonder, one question kept lingering in the air. Why had the house cat chosen this bobcat? And more importantly, what had they been through together? The rescue center sat on the edge of a small rural town, tucked between low rolling hills and dense patches of pine forest. The building itself wasn't much, an old converted barn with drafty corners and creaky floors, but it was a safe haven for animals that had nowhere else to go. Out back, you could hear the wind rustle through the trees, the distant calls of birds overhead, and sometimes the bark of a fox or the hoot of an owl. But inside the center, especially in the quiet of early morning, it felt almost sacred, like time slowed down for those who had been broken and needed healing. The bobcat, now named Bruno by the staff, was kept in a private enclosure designed for large wildlife. Thick plexiglass panels lined the walls, and behind them sat a bed of straw, some enrichment toys, and medical monitors softly beeping. His body was still weak, but his eyes, pale gold and piercing, were alert, watching, waiting. Right beside him, curled in a smaller basket lined with an old flannel blanket, was a house cat, Willow, named for her gray, wind-blown fur and her silent, graceful movements. No one knew where she came from. No chip, no collar. But one thing was clear, she wasn't feral. She had once known people, perhaps even belonged to someone, and yet now she belonged here. The staff tried to separate them at first. They worried about safety, infection, unpredictability. But every time they moved Willow into a different room, she'd yowl so loudly that echoed through the hallways. When kept apart, Bruno thrashed and growled until his bandaged leg bled again. But when placed side by side, even separated by a transparent barrier, both calmed immediately. Their breathing evened out. Their eyes softened. The stress melted away. So, the staff made a decision. They would stay close, under supervision. Days turned into weeks. The snow outside began to melt, giving way to muddy trails and budding branches. Inside the center, Willow and Bruno's presence began to draw quiet reverence. Volunteers would peek just to watch them lie beside each other in silence, or witness Willow gently grooming Bruno's fur near his injured shoulder. It was a kind of bond that didn't need explaining. It just was. What no one could see, though, was how much they were changing each other. Bruno, once wild and reactive, had become different, not tame. He would always be a wild creature, but more grounded. His eyes no longer darted at every movement. He responded less aggressively to treatment. He began to eat from bowls when Willow was beside him, something he refused to do when alone. Willow, too, had changed. She no longer shied away from loud sounds or strange people. She had begun exploring the edges of the enclosure, venturing further from Bruno's side, but never too far, always with a glance back, always making sure he was still there. They had found something in each other, safety, perhaps, or maybe a shared understanding of survival, of loss. The rescue center director, Kara Morales, an animal behaviorist with 20 years of experience, began to document their interactions. She'd never seen anything like it. She noted their synchronized routines. When Bruno stretched, Willow would too. When Willow napped, Bruno seemed to relax more deeply. There was a rhythm between them, a silent language, far beyond what anyone could label as coincidence. Karen often sat alone at her desk at night, reviewing footage, scratching her head and murmuring to herself, "What happened out there in that forest?" Because that question still remained. Had Willow found Bruno when he was already injured? Or had they been traveling together before the trap? Was she once a pet lost of the woods, drawn to him by hunger and fear? Or was there something even deeper? The forest around the rescue center was vast. Remote cabins dotted the hills, but few people lived there year-round. It was a kind of place where stories disappeared and animals became ghosts. But now, two of those ghosts were under one roof. And with every passing day, the connection between them grew stronger and stranger. Visitors began to trickle in, asking about the cat and the bobcat. Some were skeptical, thinking the staff exaggerated the tale. But once they stood before the enclosure and saw Willow resting against Bruno's side, both purring in tandem, their doubt melted away. There was no need for words. The story was writing itself. Through fur, through glances, through small, tender moments that no one expected to matter so much. But while the world around them began to warm and heal, something else was stirring, something subtle, something unseen. Bruno had started pacing at night. And Willow, she was beginning to stare out the window far more often, eyes narrowed toward the tree-line, as if she was waiting for something, or someone. It started with a nudge. One quiet morning, as the staff went through their usual routines, cleaning enclosures, checking vitals, logging notes, Karen noticed something new on the surveillance monitor. Bruno, who had always been cautious and still, reached out with his paw. Not to claw, not to strike, but to gently tap Willow on the side as she lay dozing next to him. Her ears flicked, her eyes open, and without hesitation, she scooted closer, pressing her small body into his. And for the first time, Bruno closed his eyes with a sense of ease the team hadn't seen before. That moment marked a turning point. The connection between the two was no longer just calming. It was affectionate, purposeful. Willow had taken on a role that surprised everyone. She wasn't just Bruno's shadow. She had become his caretaker. She groomed the fur around his injured leg every day, even when he flinched. She brought him little offerings, twigs, feathers, even a rubber glove she'd somehow fished in the corner of the enclosure. Bruno, in turn, began sharing his food. When the staff placed fresh meat into his bowl, he would nudge a piece toward Willow before taking a bite himself. It was behavior no one could explain. Karen decided to start observing them closer, this time in person. She brought a small stool into the corner of the enclosure and sat quietly, clipboard in hand, expecting the animals to withdraw. But Willow simply glanced at her, then returned to Bruno's side. Bruno watched her for a while, then lay down, placing his head near Willow's, their breaths sinking like they were one creature with two bodies. Karen scribbled in her notes. Mutual co-regulation behavior? Pack bond mimicry? But in her heart, she didn't need a scientific term. What she was witnessing was rare, deep, almost sacred. Volunteers began requesting more shifts just to be near the two. They brought soft blankets, gentle music, and special treats. Willow was particularly fond of a calming tune someone played on a phone, a slow guitar melody. Each time it played, she would sit still and upright, while Bruno relaxed beside her, visibly soothed. Over time, both animals began to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. Bruno no longer reacted to the presence of men, who had previously made him tense. Willow began greeting staff at the enclosure door, even rubbing against their boots before returning to Bruno. One volunteer, Jenna, a young vet intern, became especially attached. She started reading to them during her late shifts. Not children's stories, but old nature essays, pieces about forest survival and companionship. Sometimes, Willow would climb into her lap as she read, but only when Bruno was already resting peacefully. Even then, Bruno would raise his head slightly, watch, and then, if satisfied, let it fall back with a heavy sigh. But their bond wasn't just about shared space or healing. It was about trust, and more than that, choice. One cold evening, the center briefly lost power. Panic rippled through the staff as heaters and security systems went offline. In the dim emergency light, Karen ran to check on Bruno and Willow. To her shock, the access gate to their enclosure had jammed slightly open from the power drop. For any wild animal, it would have been instinctual. Run, escape, vanish into the woods. But when she arrived, she didn't find a hole torn through the screen or claw marks by the door. She found Willow curled into Bruno's chest, their bodies tightly wound together for warmth, both unmoving. Their eyes fixed calmly on the door, as if waiting for someone to come and reassure them it would all be okay. Bruno had stayed, because Willow had stayed, and something in Karen's heart softened more than she expected. She realized this wasn't about instincts anymore. This was about decisions. Each animal had chosen to be there, chosen each other. Over the next few days, the weather shifted, and with it came more behavioral changes. Bruno became more vocal, low, guttural sounds that were somewhere between a growl and a purr. Willow mimicked him, letting out chirps and trills no one had heard from her before. It was as if they had developed their own language. Karen spoke with a wildlife psychologist from a nearby university. She shared footage, notes, observations. The expert was stunned. He suggested this might be an extremely rare case of cross-species emotional imprinting, when two animals form a deep bond, usually after trauma, that overrides natural boundaries. Karen nodded along, but didn't need a textbook explanation. She could see it every day. In the way Bruno's wild tension melted when Willow approached. In the way Willow leaned her head against him and blinked slowly, confidently, an act of feline trust. And yet, beneath the growing warmth in the center, a subtle unease began to rise. Because as spring approached and Bruno's strength returned, so did his instincts. He began climbing the enclosure walls more often, staring out of the upper windows, pawing at the wooden beams above. Willow, too, had grown more restless. She would pace near the door every morning, stopping only to wait for Bruno to follow. Her tail flicked with a different kind of energy now, not anxiety, but anticipation. It was clear they were both healing, but it was also becoming clear they didn't plan to stay. It started with a distant growl, low, steady, and unlike anything the staff had heard from Bruno before. Karen had been reviewing paperwork in her office when the sound filtered through the quiet halls of the rescue center. At first, she thought it was part of a recorded video, but when she glanced up at the live monitor for Bruno and Willow's enclosure, she saw it. Bruno standing stiffly near the back wall, body tense, eyes locked in the tree line just outside the nearest window. Willow was crouched beside him, tail flicking, ears flat. Something was out there. Karen rose from her desk and moved quickly through the corridor, the hairs on her arms standing up. By the time she reached the enclosure, Bruno had settled, but the atmosphere was different. Heavy, charged. Willow hadn't taken her eyes off the window. She didn't move, not even when Karen softly called her name. That night, Bruno didn't sleep. The cameras caught him pacing, tail lashing. Willow stayed close, occasionally rubbing against him as if trying to soothe whatever was stirring inside. But it didn't work. Something was shifting. By morning, the staff noticed more changes. Bruno had begun refusing food again, unless Willow touched it first. He'd sit by the enclosure door for hours, silent and waiting. Willow, too, became more alert, less playful, more focused. The soft edges of their bond were still there, but they were being overshadowed by something bigger, something primal. Then came the incident. It was during a routine cleaning. Jenna and another staff member, Sam, entered the enclosure as they always did, calmly, cautiously, with Willow and Bruno used to their presence. But this time, when Sam reached over to move a water bowl near Bruno's side, the bobcat let out a growl so sudden, so sharp, it made both of them freeze. He didn't attack, didn't lunge, but he placed himself squarely between Willow and the humans, lowering his body, his eyes locked and unblinking. It wasn't just a protective stance. It was a warning. Karen had intervened. The enclosure was cleared. And for the first time since Bruno's arrival, the center considered the unthinkable, separating them. "We don't know what's going on," Sam muttered later that day. "But something's changed. He's not the same." Karen nodded slowly. She'd seen it too. The tenderness remained, yes, but it was now laced with something darker, something closer to instinct. Reports from the area began to trickle in. Sightings of wild bobcats circling closer to the outskirts of town. A chicken coop broken into. Scratch marks near a hiking trail. The Wildlife Authority issued warnings. And suddenly, the presence of a recovering bobcat at the center didn't seem so safe. The board started asking questions. Is this animal still under control? Can we ensure public safety? What if he escapes? The real question no one dared say out loud. What if he doesn't want to stay anymore? Inside the center, staff were divided. Some argued that Bruno and Willow should remain together. It was the only thing keeping him calm. Others believed the bond had served its purpose. It was time to rehabilitate them separately. There were debates, raised voices, and throughout it all, Bruno and Willow remained side by side, oblivious of the tension rising around them. Then came the second incident. Late one evening, a power fluctuation caused the automatic security latch on their enclosure to malfunction just for a moment. When Karen arrived early the next morning, she found the outer gate slightly ajar. Her heart dropped. She rushed to the enclosure. It was empty. Panic surged through the center. Staff scrambled, calling out through the property, checking every hallway, every corner. Wildlife authorities were notified. Fear gripped the entire team. If Bruno had escaped into the wild, what would he do? And would Willow follow him? But before the search escalated further, Jenna found them, less than a quarter mile from the property, sitting quietly at the edge of the forest. Bruno had not run. He was just waiting, watching the woods. Willow was curled up beside him, calm, as if they were taking in the morning air. No attempt had been made to flee. Still, the message was clear. They wanted the option, the freedom, the choice. That day, Karen made the hardest call of her career. She scheduled a final review session with the state's Wildlife Release Committee. Bruno's condition had vastly improved. He was strong, alert. His leg had healed. He could hunt, climb, and survive. Technically, he met the criteria for release into the wild. But the question that haunted everyone was, what about Willow? She was domestic, vulnerable. She couldn't survive out there. But separating them now, after everything, felt cruel. In her office, Karen stared at the footage one last time. Bruno resting, Willow stretched across his side, their eyes closed, their breaths slow and synchronized. She whispered, "How do I choose between what's natural and what's right?" As the release date neared, tension filled the center. Everyone knew this story had changed them. that this strange, beautiful friendship had become more than just an anomaly. It was a lesson, a challenge of what they thought they knew about connection, about boundaries. But nature has its own rules, and soon the decision would no longer be in their hands. The morning of Bruno's release was crisp, with sunlight filtering through the pine trees in long golden beams. The rescue center had been unusually quiet all night, as if the animals themselves sensed what was about to happen. Even Willow was still, no pacing, no sounds, just silence. Karen stood by the enclosure, clipboard in hand, trying to appear composed, but her eyes kept drifting to the pair one last time. Bruno, calm but watchful. Willow, curled into him so closely that their fur seemed to blend. She didn't know how this would end. The wildlife team arrived in their standard gear: gloves, tranquilizers, crates, tags. All routine, all clinical. But nothing about this story had ever been routine. A release site had already been selected. A protected reserve over 50 miles away, far enough that Bruno wouldn't wander back to town, but wild enough to give him the freedom he deserved. When the team entered the enclosure, Bruno stood tall. He didn't growl. He didn't run. He simply stepped in front of Willow, his body a barrier once again. Willow rose too, pressing against his side, her ears forward but unafraid. Karen stepped in, gently asking the handlers to back off for a moment. She knelt near the plexiglass door and opened it slowly. Willow padded toward her cautiously. Karen whispered, "I know you don't understand, but you need to trust me, just like you trusted him." Willow looked back once at Bruno. Then, for the first time, she walked out of the enclosure without him. Bruno didn't follow. He stayed behind as the handlers carefully prepped him for transport. A quick sedative, a GPS tag. The crate door clicked shut. Hours passed. By late afternoon, the rescue van pulled into the release site. Bruno had stirred by then, groggy but conscious. The door to his crate was unlatched, and for a long time, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he stepped out onto the soft, mossy ground. He lifted his nose to the air, took in the scent of pine needles, damp earth, freedom. But his ears twitched. His body shifted back toward the crate. Something was missing. Back at the center, Willow was not herself. She didn't eat, didn't move. She sat by the wall of the now empty enclosure for hours, her eyes locked on the spot where Bruno used to lie. Staff tried everything: warm food, toys, music. But Willow was gone in spirit. Her body was there, but her heart wasn't. Karen couldn't take it anymore. That night, she drove back to the release site, alone, taking only what she needed: a crate, a blanket Bruno had slept on, and Willow. It was a risk, an unauthorized move, a choice based not on rules, but on something else entirely. She parked at the edge of the forest, set the crate down, opened the door. Willow stepped out. Cautiously, slowly, she paused for a long time, as if listening. Then, ears up, she darted into woods. Karen sat in the truck for hours, waiting, hoping. Days passed. The reserve staff placed trail cams in the area where Bruno had been released. They wanted to track his adjustment, ensure he was surviving. And then, on a chilly morning, one camera captured it. Bruno, sitting near a stream, and beside him, tiny, gray-furred, alert, was Willow. She had found him. No one knew how. No one could explain it. But there they were, side by side again, the bobcat and the house cat, unleashed, reunited, and together in the wild. What followed stunned everyone. The reserve team noticed that Bruno began marking a territory that was smaller than most bobcats typically claimed. He stayed close to the same area. Willow was often seen hunting insects or curling up on a rock nearby. At night, trail cam footage showed them sleeping together under the shelter of a fallen log, wrapped around each other like always. Against all odds, in a world that rarely bends for what's unusual or inconvenient, they had made their own space. A space where they could exist exactly as they were. Not pets, not predators, just companions. Their story went viral. News outlets picked it up. Documentaries wanted rights. Animal behaviors wrote papers. Some called it emotional imprinting. Others claimed it was survival dependency. But those who had seen it firsthand, Karen, Jenna, the volunteers, knew better. This was love, not in the way humans explain it, not with flowers or rings, but in the way nature does, through presence, through loyalty, through never letting go even when every rule says you should. And in that forest, where no one was supposed to find friendship, much less family, they prove that some bonds are not only real, they're unbreakable. The forest was quiet that morning, still cloaked in a soft mist. Through the tangled brush and moss-covered trees, the motion-triggered camera blinked on once more, its lens focusing just in time to catch two familiar shapes. Bruno, the once wounded bobcat, padded slowly across the clearing. His body was lean now, toned, his stride confident and strong. He paused by a stream, lapping at the water, ears swiveling with every sound. But he wasn't alone. A second later, Willow emerged from the undergrowth, her small paws barely making a sound on the wet leaves. She leapt up onto a low rock near him, stretched her legs, and rubbed her head affectionately against his shoulder. Even here, in the heart of the wild, they moved like one. The reserve staff had grown used to their presence. Though Bruno was a wild predator, he had never posed a threat to people nearby. His territory stayed small, centered around a glade with good water and shelter. And wherever Bruno went, Willow was only a few steps behind. They were seen in all seasons, basking in the filtered sunlight of spring, curled together under the snow-dusted roots of an old tree in winter, chasing insects in the playful haze of summer. Sometimes, Bruno would vanish into the deeper woods for a day or two, but he always came back. And Willow always waited. Karen visited the reserve often. She never tried to interfere, never called to them. She simply stood at the edge of protected land, scanning the horizon. Every now and then, she caught sight of them, and each time, her eyes welled up a mix of pride and awe. They had made it on their terms. It had taken months for the story to fade from the media. At first, everyone wanted a piece of it. A TV segment here, a podcast there, even a publishing offer. But Karen declined most of it. She knew that to overexpose her story would be to exploit what was sacred about it. So she let the world talk. And she let the animals be. Back at the rescue center, a new plaque hung in the hallway. It wasn't flashy, just a small brass plate beneath a framed photo of Bruno and Willow lying side by side. It read, "Some bonds aren't taught. They're found, and when they're real, nothing can break them." The staff often pointed it out to new volunteers, not as a curiosity, but as a reminder. That connection, in its purest form, doesn't need logic or permission. It just needs trust. And in the months that followed, something beautiful began to happen. Inspired by Bruno and Willow's story, people who had feared wild animals began volunteering. Parents brought their children to the center, wanting them to see kindness between species with their own eyes. Donations increased, and more animals, wild and domestic, were brought in, treated, and healed. But perhaps the most remarkable shift was internal. The way the team looked at animals changed. No longer did they just see behaviors, symptoms, or species differences. They saw stories, emotions, bonds waiting to form. They remembered Bruno, the fierce bobcat who once bared his teeth at the world, and how it allowed a fragile little house cat to curl into him without hesitation. And they remembered Willow, the lost and quiet creature, who had never asked for anything but refused to leave someone behind. Years later, when a young volunteer asked Karen what she thought made their bond so special, Karen smiled thoughtfully and said, "They didn't see what separated them, only what they needed and what they could give each other." And maybe that was the real lesson. That connection isn't about sameness. It's about choice, about standing beside someone not because you have to, but because you want to. Out in the woods, far from the cameras and the headlines, Bruno and Willow were still together, still finding warmth beneath the trees, still trusting each other in a world that never expected them to meet, let alone stay. They weren't alike, but that didn't matter. They had chosen each other, and they had never looked back. Sometimes, the most powerful relationships aren't the ones that make sense. They're the ones that make you feel safe, seen, and understood, no matter how different you may be.